There we go. Okay. Thanks for coming, everyone. So this is my presentation on color blocking. So what is color blocking? Color blocking is adding seams to a pattern piece without changing the fit. So for example, a princess seam would not usually be considered a color blocking seam because it adds shape. So it does change the fit of the style. So color blocking seams allow you to use multiple fabric prints and colors and to use smaller pieces to make one bigger piece. In this example here, I've got a plain dolman that I was wearing the green one before, and then this one was made by adding a seam across the top of it so that I could use a smaller piece of fabric for the top part. How to color block. So first of all, if you are doing asymmetrical color blocking, so where it's not going to be the exact same on both sides, and your piece has a fold, then you're going to need to unfold the piece. So what that means is that you'll need to trace one half of your piece and then flip it over and trace the other half to make a full piece. Next, you're going to draw your lines on your piece where you want the seams to be and cut them. So we're going to start with a single seam, but there will be some examples with multiple seams as well. So for adding seam allowance, after you've cut your piece, you will want to either tape it to a piece of paper or you can trace it like I've done here. For a straight seam, it's pretty simple to add the seam allowance. You can use a ruler and just make another line, the exact distance of your seam allowance away from the cut edge. At the corners, you can either follow the original pattern line or you can square them off as I've done here by drawing a line that is perpendicular to your seam allowance line. I'll explain a little bit later why this matters a little bit, how you do your corners, but I do prefer to square them off wherever possible. It just makes it a little bit easier to match everything up. So here we've got the pieces cut out with the seam allowance, and this is how you would sew them together. You can see how the squared off edges match up perfectly, and you can just sew along that line. It takes the guesswork out of where to sew. But I am going to show you where you would sew if your lines were not squared off. Okay, so if you're adding multiple seams, you need to make sure to add your seam allowance to all of the cut edges, including your intersecting corners. So in my example here, I've squared off the edges, but the corners you can't square off. So you're just going to draw your lines until they intersect, and that will make your corner. So when you're sewing, no matter how you've added the seam allowance at the corners, you can sew it correctly as long as you make sure to match the stitching line and not the raw edge of the fabric. I've got a video that will show you exactly how this works. So this is a rectangle with an angled seam on it. And you can see if you match up the raw edges and then stitch at the seam allowance, when you flip it, it doesn't match. So what you're going to have to do whenever you're sewing a seam is make sure that the stitching line matches up. And you can see how the raw edge does not match up here, but the stitching line does. And when it's sewn and flipped, then it looks perfect. So for a curved seam, I like to add notches. It makes it much easier to match up your curved seams when you're sewing them. So you can just draw a line for your notch that's perpendicular to the cut. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to add seam allowance on a curve. So I've traced the piece, but again, you could tape it to a piece of paper. So you're going to measure and make a series of marks, the distance of the seam allowance away from your cut edge. And then again, I like to square off the corners and then just fill in all of those marks to make a curved line. And transfer your notches to the edge of the seam allowance. So this shows you how the notches work to make it much easier to match those opposite curves together, because it can be very tricky to match opposite curves correctly. It's harder to tell with curves that they are in fact the same length. And the notches just help you to make sure you've matched them in the correct spot. Okay, so here's some tips for complex color blocking. So if you're adding a lot of seams, first of all, you're going to want to label all your pieces. So 1, 2, 3, ABC, however you want to do that. Just write a label on each piece. You want to take a photo of your piece before you cut it apart so that you know how to piece it back together afterwards. And you want to start by sewing together pieces that share a continuous seam on one edge. So I'll show you how this works. So in this example, I would sew together 1 and 2 first because they share a line that's not shared by any other pieces. And then I would sew 3 and 4 because they've got lines on either side that are shared. Then I would add 5 to 3 and 4. I'd add 6 to 3 and 4. Then I would add 1 and 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I would add 7 on that edge there because it's the only one with that long edge there. That's it. That's my presentation. So if you've got any questions, let me know. And I will be uploading this recording to the Facebook group, and I will also be emailing it out to the newsletter list.